Greetings, you curious and Herle Burly-ites. Tuesday this week was Budget Day, the Carney government's long-awaited first. And just to give our listeners a sharper time stamp for today's conversation, we're recording this pod on Budget Day +2, or less laboriously, Thursday. As we typically do when there's a fresh budget to pick apart, we've assembled the policy panel for our very own Herle Burly Budget Lock-up. Dr. Jennifer Robson, Tyler Meredith, and Ben Woodfinden are here to give us their 2 days of cogitation post-budget analysis. So you loyal Herle Burly-ites know Jennifer and Tyler well, but Ben is new to the panel, so I'm going to start the bona fides with him. Only 1 month ago, he joined Meredith, Boessenkool Phillips as a senior advisor and director of their new premium policy intelligence service, MBP Intelligence. Over his career, he's provided advice, translated policy, and shaped messaging in the highest stakes political environments, most recently as Director of Comms for Pierre Poilievre. Jennifer has served in senior roles in policy development and research with the federal government, and she's now the Program Director and Associate Professor of Political Management at Carleton University and a Fellow of the Public Policy Forum. And Tyler is the former Head of Fiscal and Economic Policy for Prime Minister Trudeau and Ministers of Finance Chrystia Freeland and Bill Morneau. In other words, all previous budgets to this, he wrote them. Today, he's a founding partner at Meredith, Boessenkool Phillips Policy Advisors. Tyler, Jennifer, Ben, thanks for doing this with me today. It's a great lineup, and we've got a lot of meat to get into. You're all good? Jennifer, you're good?
Good, except one little thing. I should probably correct. I'm actually not a fellow with PPF anymore.
Really?
I switched over to IRPP. But I am still the director of the program here at Carleton. And by the way, we have an info session coming up later this month. People should check it out if they're interested in our program.
Such a great program. If you want to work in anything adjacent to the political world, it's such a great program.
Thank you.
And IRPP is great too. You know, they look forward to the gala instead of the PPF gala. All right, Tyler, you're good?
Absolutely.
Right. Ben, you're new to this panel.
Ready to go.
You're ready to go. All right. So let's start off talking about this thing. I just want to get a level set where you're all at. So Tyler, I'm going to start with you, and I want the three of you to give me a letter grade for this budget and a few sentences on why you picked that grade.
Well, so I have to probably give it, I'm going to say an A-. And I say that because I think it did a lot of what it needed to do in terms of working to implement much of the mandate that the Prime Minister ran on in the last campaign. It wasn't everything. And I think we can get into this later as to the choices of what they didn't put in this budget compared to the things that they ran on. But they also managed expectations relatively well, right? I think people were expecting coming into this that the deficit would be higher than it ended up being. There was, bank economists that were saying it could be as high as $100 billion this year. It ended up being about 78. That's still a high number, but it's much lower than I think people were expecting. And bond markets have reacted relatively well. I think where it may have fallen short is they set the expectation, however, that it would be the generational investment budget. And I think in some ways it's probably more of a work in progress budget. It's quite significant in terms of what it does, but I'm not sure that I would have necessarily set that expectation in advance. But there's some pretty significant stuff that we can get into in this discussion.
Okay. Jennifer, your rating?
My rating. Okay. I was just thinking, should we do this like on a pass-fail scale, or okay, we're going with
letter grade. Letter grade.
Letter grade. Okay. So I would say probably somewhere in a B to B plus. I might be a tougher grader than Tyler, maybe. But I think for some of the same
reasons. You want to
take
my course at Monk, not hers.
So I think probably for some of the same reasons, in that it's like they got some of the big framework pieces right for the context of, a country at economic war and some of the investments that they're trying to redirect there, some of the signals around how they are setting new priorities. But I don't know that this is generational change. And I think that there are also components that did not get included in this that I worry might come back to bite them later on.
Okay. All right. And Ben?
Well, unsurprisingly, I think I'd probably give it maybe generously a C-. I'll echo what's been said before, but maybe offer a slightly different take on this. This was touted as a kind of a generational, transformational budget. And like, look, I do think it moved in the right direction on some things. It is good to see finally that a Liberal government is finally talking about things like productivity and stuff like that. But I think very much it was kind of it didn't match the scale of what was promised. The Prime Minister's repeatedly talked about wanting to build at speeds we haven't seen in a generation, and this budget doesn't do that. So I think the generous interpretation of that would be this is, there's more to come, but I still don't think that meets the scale of this moment. And obviously, a lot of that is the moment we're in. There's a lot of that's to do with Trump and the tariff war and everything like that. But I do think the budget gives a very it gives a very interesting indictment of maybe the last 10 years of government. It talks about, things like declining productivity, declining investment. And it's good that it is genuinely good to see liberals talking about that now. But I don't think this budget is actually, it's tinkering at the margins as opposed to doing the kind of transformational stuff that this country needs. So like I say, I do think it's a shift in the right direction, but I don't think it represents a radical departure from the previous government, from the Trudeau government.
Okay, so I think this is what Ben just articulated there, and what Jennifer had said as well is I think the most common critique of the budget I'm hearing. Not that it is bad, just that it's not what it was built to be, and maybe not what it needed to be. So I want to come at this a couple of different ways. And I just want to warn you, I do have some set questions I want to get through before, as usual, I lose control of this and it all just becomes a cacophony of people screaming at each other. So I want to come at this a couple of ways. One of which is, Tyler, you worked with the Prime Minister a little bit on platform preparation development. And if I know you, you've studied the detail of this budget very carefully. Why do you think that he thinks it's generational?
Well, because I think the level of investment, as a macroeconomist, I think you always have to remember about Mark Carney that he is ultimately a central banker at heart. And I say that actually as a positive, because I think in this moment in time, he's looking at an environment in which growth prospects for Canada are dimming. Growth this year is going to be about half of what it was expected to be this year, at the last time the fall economic statement last year was tabled. And we're in the midst of a transition where we need to wean ourselves off of the United States and find new paths for our exports and for how we trade with ourselves. And so in that context, it does make some very significant investments, especially on the defense side, to be able to start to rebuild some of our industrial capabilities. And I think if just in totality, if you think of this as like a central banker, as I said, right, what is the G component of the Y function of GDP, right? I think he sees that level of scale of spending, which when you add it up is somewhere in the order of about $200 billion of new investment over the course of the next 5 years. Even if that's less than kind of the mandate that he actually ran on, which was itself pretty big in the platform process, that's a pretty large and expansive mandate. And, it's interesting to me to kind of think back to, where we started when we first came into government with Trudeau, where if you had said a government's going to spend close to $200 billion worth of money in today's dollars over the next 5 years, and we'll debate that's tinkering at the margins, like my head would have popped off. Now, I think it's because we transitioned from a politics of incrementalism, about a decade and a half ago, to really needing to talk about big ideas. But like that's a pretty big throw, right? Like especially on defense. Now, I think where it probably falls short, even of the Prime Minister's own expectations for himself, is perhaps in the housing area, and we can get into that. But I think he thinks that this is significant and important because just of the scale of the investment that's involved, and that's, as a macroeconomist, what you often would focus on more, as opposed to getting into the finer point details of the individual initiatives.
Okay, and Jennifer, why wouldn't that be persuasive to you?
Why wouldn't that be persuasive? I mean, it's not that it's not persuasive. Like, I do not disagree at all with the fact that we do need to spend substantially more on defense, that there are areas of our industrial capacity that need rebuilding, in terms of energy sovereignty and pivoting, big sectors in terms of getting less dependent on the United States and thinking about our infrastructure, on and on and on. I don't disagree with any of that whatsoever. So when I said before that I feel like there's a piece that's missing here, you've got a prime minister who is talking about pivoting an economy as though we're like, he keeps talking about the comparison to wartime. And I don't think he's wrong, right? But in an economic war, who are your soldiers? It's your workers, it's your households, it's your businesses, and so forth. And so I see some stuff in here for businesses in certain sectors of the economy, certain larger employers per se, but I don't see an awful lot for the workers that you need to be willing to change jobs and do something else now instead. So that part to me feels like it's missing a little bit. There are a couple of pieces, and look, I'm not going to knock it all. There are some pieces in there that I feel good about in terms of some of the directions that they've taken. Happy to talk more about that ad nauseum, like on things like auto filing and so forth. But there's like this social part of what the government of Canada does that is important for for keeping people in the tent so that they can continue to support the investments in the infrastructure and in the energy sectors and in defense spending. And I'm not sure they got quite the balance there, right?
Interesting. Okay. Well, we'll return to that for sure. All right, you information craving Herle Burly-ites. Who wants to learn more about AI nodes and stacks? Rhetorical question. It's my pod and I make the rules. Thus, I give you more AI demystification from our presenting sponsor, TELUS, who are rightly proud of their new sovereign AI factory in Rimouski, Quebec. So, nodes. Love that sentence. 2 little words, but an infinite amount of computational power. Because an AI node is akin to a brain neuron. It works to process data. And when one node is linked to other nodes, they collectively solve the most complex problems. But while a human brain's approximately 86 billion neurons are limited by physical constraints, AI nodes can scale infinitely and process data at superhuman speeds. TELUS is using the most advanced GPUs from NVIDIA for their nodes, capable of performing trillions of calculations per second. I don't mind telling you that my personal set of 86 billion neurons, if it's still that, can hardly comprehend that. Moving on to the accurately named AI stack and what makes TELUS's so special. Accurate because it's basically layer upon layer of tech, data center, computer hardware, storage, security, networking, orchestration, platform, applications. All of these complex functions coming together in a manageable system to enable efficient and scalable AI implementation. But remember, it's not just an AI factory, it's a sovereign AI factory by design, which is true for every layer of the stack. So all components of the factory, all those layers I just talked about, are under Canadian control, empowering businesses to be AI creators here at home without foreign dependence. Next week, more AI demystification and a deeper dive into TELUS's unique relationship with NVIDIA. And Ben, from your perspective, what would have made this a generational budget? What is missing, or how is it wrong-headed? I mean, we're going to get into, I guess, the broad directions of industrial strategy, etc. But was there something you were expecting to see out of this government that you didn't get?
Well, look, I think that when I say there's a step in the right direction, I do think, again, the government acknowledging that we have problems with things like productivity and that these are things we need to address. That's good, and I think people from various different parts and stripes can agree on that. But where it falls short on this and where it doesn't actually do that is that, first of all, there's a lot of new money in this budget, including in what they're calling capital investments, right? But a lot of that was already a lot. There's not actually that much new capital investment in here. I came prepared with a number because I can't memorize these things, but only about of the so it increases capital spending from about 32 to just under 60 billion by 2029, but only about 8.3 billion of this 27 billion dollar increase is actually new. So it might be odd to hear a conservative demanding more spending, but I think that does signal maybe not a radical shift. It's an acknowledgement of the problem, but it's not taking on the scale of the challenge that we're addressing. So that's the first part. The second thing I would say, the approach the government is taking here is still very much a kind of continuation of kind of Trudeau era, kind of Ottawa knows best, kind of trying to stimulate growth, trying to stimulate investment. I think, what you'll hear from Poilievre that I think is correct is what we actually need more than anything else is to get government out of the way, and that's how we unlock all this private investment that we're looking for. And I don't think this budget does that. And then the third thing I'd say, and I think this is kind of the key point that you'll see the Conservatives seize on, is that this is a macroeconomic budget. It's a budget looking at kind of big picture stuff,
Mhm.
but normal people don't live in the macro; they live in the micro, right? And so this will probably be it was I think generally fairly welcomed by Bay Street, by banks, by these kinds of stakeholders. But if you're someone that's struggling to pay their mortgage right now, or struggling to pay rent, or you're not sure you're going to put food on the table, because grocery costs keep going up. I'm not sure there's much in this budget for you where you're going to say my life is actually going to get better. And we can debate we can debate why that is, but I also think that's probably a vulnerability for the government there, that if people don't see how this budget's going to make their lives materially better in the short term, I think that makes it weak.
Yeah, Ben, I agree with you. I mean, given the environment in which there was a potential election, it was a very unpolitical budget. The kind of budget that, in Yes Minister, the deputy might have said courageous. Um,
He did promise to govern in econometrics, don't forget.
Um, you know, uh, Ben raised the whole economic thrust and the core difference between the two parties, which is pretty stark on this, which is this budget is an industrial policy budget, and it does all the things that well, you're shaking your head. I'm going to be quite interested to hear your response,
Okay.
Jennifer, because
All right.
to me, it's all built around, here's how the economy is going to work. Here's where the winners are going to be. We have to invest in this. We have to stimulate that, and we're going to put money behind this to make sure these various things happen, as opposed to what I understand the conservative position to be, which is that if we deregulate and detax, the private sector will do these things. Now, I don't think that the government believes that, Ben. I don't think the Carney government believes, and he's not a socialist, um, but I don't think the Carney government believes the private sector would step up and do these things if the government didn't put some money on the table to encourage them. He calls it catalyzation. Maybe it's de-risking. Maybe it's whatever. But he doesn't believe they would. Why do you, or I shouldn't put those words in your mouth, do you believe that the private sector would?
Well, let me give you an example of what I think we're talking about here. Go look at something like C5, the Building Canada Act. I might be not saying that correctly, but it's Bill C5, and C5 is basically an acknowledgement it's very hard to get kind of major resource projects built, right? And the conservative theory of the case here that I do think is correct, and I do think it, and they're continuing to make it because it is correct, is that we have this whole kind of this whole broad regulatory environment that basically just makes it impossible to get these kinds of large projects built. And C5 is in many ways an implicit admission of that, but it doesn't actually fix the problems. It almost like puts a band-aid on a growing illness, right? It's kind of an end around, so you can get around some of these things like the tanker ban, um, other pieces of legislation. So it's a way of acknowledging. It's a way of implicitly acknowledging that these are problems, but it doesn't actually fix the real problems. It doesn't actually address the fundamental things that are actually, make it so that it's hard to get private sector investment.
Trains look pretty much the same as they have for 100 years. Brutally powerful machines, hauling a mile or more rail cars behind them, plowing through whatever the elements throw at them. But the railroaders at our sponsor CN know just how much more is going on that we cannot see. Like so many other moving things, trains are now effectively computers, carrying artificial intelligence. CN has spent a fortune on technology in recent years, and a lot of it is deployed to keep the trains and the communities they pass through safe. Sensors in tracks inspect train wheels as they pass overhead. Sensors on special train cars themselves inspect the tracks and the ground beneath and alongside them. Railroad ties, ballast, spikes, and plates are under constant scrutiny across the network. LiDAR systems use pulses of laser to create 3D corridor mapping. Special portals examine wheels and brakes as trains pass through. High-speed cameras are deployed along the network, generating real-time data feeds. AI algorithms are used to detect defects in wheels, axles, and brake rigging. CN collects 24 million data points per day from nearly 3,000 detectors that constantly monitor the health of its trains, supporting predictive maintenance. And all of this is done at full speed. It's been going on for years, and CN has conclusively demonstrated that advanced autonomous inspection technologies outperform traditional manual methods done by human beings. The tech has detected a significant number of defects that may otherwise have gone unnoticed. The railway is much safer than it was even a decade ago. But as is often the case, regulations have not kept up. Innovation will continue to transform the railway. CN wants to leverage and expand autonomous inspection technology. As it does, new opportunities will emerge for its railroaders, for them to have an even greater impact in moving Canada's economy. It will be good for the railway, for Transport Canada's inspectors, and for the communities along its vast network of tracks. Years of data speaks for itself. It's time for the government to let the railways move ahead. Wait a second. There's two elements to that. I agree with you. It sounds to me like the whole major projects office, and Tyler, maybe you can jump in here too. It sounds to me that the whole major projects office is an effort to say, listen, there is too much of a regulatory burden in this country and we need to circumvent it. And it would be easier just to create this office that circumvents those regs than it would be to go back and remove and rationalize all those federal and provincial regs. I don't know whether that's right or not. But whether that's right, but even so, the government acknowledges that but still thinks there needs to be money, skin in the game by the government to get these things going. Tyler, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, look, I think you kind of alluded to it there, David, which is so you can take government, take regulation off the table. But at the end of the day, there's still going to be years worth of work that a private business is going to have to go through around deciding whether or not they want to make an investment. And they may still come to the end of the process and say, no, I won't, right? And a good example of that is, the Pathways Project. It is one of the iconic things that if we do, will, as the Prime Minister says, help decarbonize our oil, right? We've been talking about that project for years. The government of Canada put in place a financing mechanism, which they've now had to extend in this budget for another 5 years because the whole thing has been so delayed, right? So government has the money available. It's said that it's willing to support the project. We're waiting for a decision. We're waiting for those boardrooms to kind of sit around and make a decision. And so I think what's interesting about this budget is the Prime Minister's put the money on the table to get moving a certain amount of public sector investment, because I think his view is that will help jolt the economy in the short term while we wait for some of these private sector decisions to be made. And hopefully there is confidence inducing behavior as a result of this budget that people can take confidence that they will be in a regulatory system that would allow them to make those positive decisions. But it's still going to take time for that to happen. In the interim, we need growth. And so the public sector is able to provide that as a bridge before we get to those investments. But at the end of the day, the question will be coming out of this budget. Is corporate Canada going to actually step up? And I think what's really interesting about this budget, right, is that front and center in the budget is the chart that shows that the marginal effective tax rate on investment in Canada will now be, as a result of this budget, substantially lower again than the United States, even after the One Big Beautiful Bill. Well, that's great. But I think we also understand, even as I think Ben and you were kind of describing in this conversation, it's not all about taxes, just as much as it's not all about regulation. I actually think there's maybe a cultural problem here, right? Which is people are so addicted to the US market in the sense that it's so easy to make money and to place money in the US market, including by our own Canadian companies and pension funds that go there, that it will take a long time for us to pull ourselves out of that focus. And that's in part why we need the public sector to step up in the short term.
Can I do a quick chase on that one, David?
Please.
Yeah. Just on the major projects office, excuse me, but also on this issue of like the incentives for investment. So look, there's stuff in here, right, around some of it is like the reason I was shaking my head or sort of going like maybe kind of sort of industrial policy, because there are some things that are targeted to particular sectors. Like industrial policy works best when it like you're thoughtful about like how much you're spreading the peanut butter on which parts of the toast,
Right.
as opposed to just sprinkling it everywhere.
Right to
And
the
then-
edges for me.
Right to,
Jennifer,
oh,
right to
sure,
the
fair
edges
enough.
for
Fair
me.
enough. Every bite must have some portion of peanut butter. That's right. That's right. So, like, look, if you were focused on a defense industrial strategy, on critical minerals,
Mhm.
on some of the energy producing and electricity sectors, like there's stuff in here for those sectors, but some of the other pieces, like the immediate expensing, the so-called super deduction, right, that they're introducing, or some of the effort to fast track, simplify the process of getting the R&D tax credits, like that's for everybody, right? And so that's not necessarily quite as targeted. And I get it that it creates a nice headline to be able to show we now have an effective tax rate that is more attractive for investment than in the United States post Big Beautiful Bill. But let me come back to this issue of the fit then with the Major Projects Office and sort of how these two things are working. I had always interpreted the Major Projects Office as being it's not just about the federal government putting a little bit of seed money in to try and, I'm going to use the term crowd in. Of course, I know that's the parlance, right? Private crowd in private sector money. But it was also like that the federal government would be offering a concierge service,
Yeah,
right? That
that's
they
right.
would
Yeah.
be they would use their power to convene stakeholders to reach agreements faster, that they would also use the power of the bully pulpit, right? To be able to say, we're the government, we've identified this as being in the national interest, we'd like to see it go ahead. And I've got to say that like the story that broke last week about the relationship between the Major Projects Office and the Indigenous leaders in Manitoba had me going, uh-oh, right? Because a big part of how that office is going to be able to be effective isn't just going to be about the money that they can put on the table, but it's about their effectiveness in playing that convener role. So like that's the part that I think they have to still focus on. It's not just about the dollars on the spreadsheet. It's also about how are you working with other stakeholders who can, if they really wanted to, like create a lot of problems in moving forward.
And I think what Jen has just hit on is absolutely correct because I actually think the government doesn't want to put money in a lot of these projects. There's bits and pieces of it, and certainly like on critical minerals, there's now a $2 billion fund that will enable them to do that. But if it had a choice, the government of Canada really doesn't want to be financing all of these deals. The Major Project Office is kind of meant to be a bit of a way station to say, let's take that ambition. Don't worry, we can run it through a process. We'll work with other at the provincial level for their similar processes so that it's one single window to give that confidence, but also, and this is what's really important about the Major Projects Office, to also potentially negotiate conditions around what those projects look like on the other side. I think people forget that implicit in C5 is a godlike power that Minister LeBlanc has now appropriated for himself, where he can and the Prime Minister can set conditions around environmental performance, around Indigenous engagement, around unionization, around climate commitments. And, we haven't seen that necessarily in the public sector at the federal level before, right? The conditions that would get attached to projects in the past would have been about how to mitigate all the bad things that happen. This now can actually add good things to those projects. Now we have to be careful how that's done, so that we don't over egg the pudding in a sense and get proponents to walk away. But there's a transactionality there, right? That may potentially open up the ability to rethink social license in a number of cases.
Hey Ben, I want to pick up with you a little bit about business culture. Is maybe my last swing at this thing. Years ago, when Prime Minister Harper was still in office, so this is before 10 years of Trudeau climate-based regulations, etc. Um, I was having lunch with a senior deputy, assistant deputy minister in the years that Mr. Martin was the finance minister. And he very, very market oriented person, one of the key architects of the balancing the budget thing. And he was bemoaning to me the inability to get Canadian business to invest and how he felt that they had done almost everything conceivable in the tax system to try to get people to invest and businesses to invest. And it just didn't seem to have the ambition that the country needed. So when I look at if that was true then, if I look at our situation now with Trump and America and all the uncertainty that comes from that, why would business start making massive investments in Canada?
Well, I'd say a few things. First, I do think I think we can all acknowledge that the world has changed in the last 8 months very, very dramatically, and maybe not completely unexpectedly, but it's moving. The change has come, I think, quicker than maybe lots of us expected. So that does demand, this is in that sense a wartime moment, right? I do think there is, and the government, I think, is partially what they're doing is they are trying to kind of throw the ball into the court of the private sector and say, it's up to you now. We're doing our part. You need to do your part now. Um, but I'd say a few things to this. One, as much as the government is trying to crowd in private sector investment, it's also true that public spending can crowd out investment as well, right? Um, let's to be determined on that. The government is in the budget. They say they want to enable about $1 trillion in total investment, and that's about I think 500 billion of that is public sector, and then the other 500 billion is that private sector investment. So that's a lot of money. Um, so yeah, to a certain extent,
Is it, by the way? I'm not an economist. Is that a lot of money? I have no idea.
got a lot
Yeah,
of zeros at the end of it.
a
All
lot
right.
of
Well,
money.
I mean, no, it's a lot of money if I had it, but is it a lot of money to be invested in Canada right now? Is that game changing? Is that a game changing number?
Yeah, I mean, so if we just did that over 5 years, right, $1 trillion over 5 years potentially, we'd be talking about, $200 billion a year, and in GDP terms, that would be about, well, I mean, GDP is 3.2 trillion, so
Mhm.
sorry, I'm trying to do quick math,
I
6%.
know. Yeah, thereabouts. Sounds right.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. All
That's
right.
not bad. That's not bad.
Not bad.
The following is a political advertisement. To build a strong Canadian economy, we need a Made in Canada plan. Public service workers power our economy. They support small businesses and keep our supply chain moving. Canada's economic resilience relies on having strong public services. To strengthen our economy, we need to invest in public services. Learn how at forucanada.ca. This message was paid for by the Public Service Alliance of Canada.
All right, Ben, back to you.
Yeah,
Sorry about that.
but let me say that the I think the challenge is, we've gone from what was the famous saying about the Trudeau saying about we were living next to the United States was like sharing a bed with an elephant, and
Elephant.
the elephant is not just rolled over now, they've tried to claim the entire bed, right?
Yeah.
And so that actually, I think that demands not, it demands something extraordinary. It actually demands more than just business as usual. It demands genuine radical shifts to try and get money, bring investment, bring jobs back into this country. So that might demand kind of that demands outside the box thinking. And it doesn't just demand that we be as competitive and as appealing to invest in the United States. In many ways, it requires being more competitive, right? Really being the place where investors have no choice other than to send their money because it's so tantalizing. And Canada, for all of the challenges we face, we still have some enormous advantages, right? We sit on trillions of dollars of wealth, not just in oil, but in things like critical minerals. And things like critical minerals are crucial to kind of the new economy, whatever you want to call the kind of emerging global economy. We can play a big role in that. So unlocking that stuff is going to be the key to unlocking wealth and growth and innovation and productivity in this country. But to do that, we have to be not just look friendly on par with the United States. We have to look more appealing than that, which is going to demand the kind like transformative changes. And again, that was what we were promised. And even if this budget does do stuff that kind of shifts us in that direction, tinkers with certain things here and there, I don't think anyone's going to look at this budget and think we've single-handedly, revolutionized the economic climate in this country so that money is all of a sudden going to start flowing in. Parts of it is undoubtedly the government. I do think they laid down the gauntlet to they threw down the gauntlet to the private sector and said it's up to you guys now. But I do think the kind of challenge we face here requires, it's maybe weird to hear a conservative say this, but like it requires a kind of radical shifts and radical changes that I still think are completely lacking.
Right. Right. Okay. Jennifer,
Yeah.
before the budget, the Prime Minister gave a speech
Yeah.
about what was going to be in the budget. I watched it with great interest. And he told me to get ready to make some sacrifices.
Yeah.
He told me that we were in tough times. We were going to have to do tough things, make tough choices. And I was going to have to be prepared for some sacrifices. Right. And I don't say this to brag, but I'm among the people in the country more able to make a sacrifice than most people. So I was sort of girded for this. I don't see it. What sacrifice am
Right.
I being expected to make?
Well, let's see. given your age and demographic, I don't think you personally are going to be asked to sacrifice a whole heck of a lot, at least not with this particular budget. So the public service, they're being asked to sacrifice for sure. And, we can have a conversation around like, was that overdue or not? And again, like I appreciate some of the ways that they are going about that in terms of the retirement incentives. Some of us advise them to use that tool. Who else is being asked to make some sacrifices? Well, Southwestern Ontario, the communities that are affected in terms of the auto sector, like this budget does not come to that rescue, right? Like those jobs are gone, right? That sector is not coming back.
Right.
I would say workers, and even like I wrote about this because I didn't get to read, I didn't get to see the PM speech. I read it instead. But I think it's possible even that some of the students who were in that room might be being indirectly asked to sacrifice, even though this budget doesn't exactly say so, right? In the sense that whatever their plans had been in terms of career, this is a budget that is basically prioritizing particular sectors, right? Where your undergraduate degree in, I'm assuming it was probably an undergrad course in econ or maybe poli-sci or something like that. Like this is a budget that says
And me?
Sorry?
I mean, me?
No. The students that the PM was talking to
Yeah,
when
exactly,
he made that like sacrifice.
I majored in the cafeteria.
Ah, see, that's a transferable skill. That's a really useful transferable skill, right? Yeah. So like seniors have not been asked to sacrifice, right? I think there's also probably some sacrifices that we are yet to hear about. Like this is a budget that started to unveil where some of the changes to government programs are coming. I mean, certainly the community of stakeholders that is attached to women and gender equity, they caught wind of that early on and advocated for themselves, and they got a little bit of it put back. But I don't know that other stakeholder communities have done the math in terms of how it's been presented in this budget to figure out where are they being asked to give up money, right? So I think some of that sacrifice story is still yet to come.
So, Tyler, the 1995 budget, which I like to talk about because I've had so many failures in my life, I like to cling to the odd success that I've been associated with. So the 1995 budget said, okay, here's what the budget for the Department of Transportation was supposed to be. And here's the new budget for the Department of Transportation, and it's 60% less than it previously was. And the way it's 60% less than it previously was is we're eliminating the crow rate, and we're eliminating the following things, right? Why does this budget lack that kind of specificity?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And it's not because I don't think they've taken decisions. I think the reason that you had that annex that was included in the budget document where it detailed the $55 billion in savings is because they have, I think, taken those decisions. And I think they know how that plays out across departments. And I think they were maybe a little worried about wanting to overexpose themselves before they get to main estimates and people see where the reduction in spending is going to be relative to the previous fiscal year. They didn't want to overexpose themselves in minority parliament to all of those decisions. And look, I think you can understand that, right? Like, I mean, I would put to you, David, would you have written the 1995 budget in the way that you did if you were 3 seats short of a majority, right? Probably not, I would expect, right? So like, I understand that decision, but I do think that this is where there is some risk for the government in the next number of weeks and months, in that there's a lot of hanging chads in those subchapters, right, of that annex on the expenditure review, where it makes oblique reference to decisions that clearly have been made about, like, we're going to consolidate this function within this department, we're going to recalibrate this program, and so on and so forth. There are very specific implications for grants and contributions to organizations, for FTEs, for programs that will all fall out from that. And they know what those are right now, but it's not detailed. And so I think there's a risk that there will be a drip around those details, and we'll see what that nets out as. And the last point I can just make, just to put this in context, because I think, a lot of emphasis has been made about the spend, right? And whether the spend was significant in generational terms. The cuts are actually pretty big. Like, I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that they are sizable, right? So just to put this in context, it's a, 55 billion over 5 years, about 16 billion once it fully ramps up, 16 to 17 billion a year once it fully ramps up. Just to put that in context, The DRAP program that got Harper in trouble, in today's dollar terms, would be about $6 to $7 billion a year. Program review under Chrétien in 1995, that infamous part of the 95 budget, excluding, of course, the changes to transfers, that was $21 billion. So it's 2.5 to 3 times as big as what Harper did, and where he got into a bit of political trouble, but less significant, but pretty close to program review in 1995. So that's a pretty big shift, right? Especially for a public service that's grown quite a bit in Ottawa in the course of the last number of years. And I think it'll be interesting to see as that information makes its way into the public, how people feel about that.
Ben, what was your take on the spending profile?
Well, look, again, this is where I think there's again there is definitely a shift in some of the kind of spending toward, like, defense was kind of the center point, right, of a lot of this new spending. And I think obviously I do think we need to spend more on defense, and we have for a long time. But it's still the deficit in this budget was like just under $79 billion. It's the largest deficit this country has run outside of the pandemic. That's still a lot of money that's being spent, and the government did kind of tweak. There's fiscal anchors in there now that have been tweaked.
Can I just say it's interesting, Ben, that it's deliberate. I mean, most deficits governments have been apologetic about, and like we wish it had been lower, and we're trying to reduce it, and next year it'll be lower, and all that kind of stuff. This one is like, no, we fucking do this, right?
Well, and look, I think part of the message they're trying to sell here, and there's a lot of messages coming out of this budget. There's a lot of different things in there that this is not an easy budget to communicate, I suspect, if you're in that comms team in the PMO. I'm sure they're pulling their hair out of this, but
should they have one?
I have no comment on that, but part of what this is an investment budget. So what Canadians should be expecting from this, what they should be demanding from this, is a return on that investment, right? If we're going to spend all this money to get more investment, then we actually need to see a return on that. And so maybe 20 years from now we could have that discussion. It might look a bit different, but I don't think this government has 20 years to show that. One, because the politics of that. It's not going to be 20 years before the next election, but also because the speed at which, again, Carney has repeatedly talked about the speed at which we need to move. And so if it takes 20 years to do this, it's too late, quite frankly, right? Like, we need to see, Canadians are going to need to see return on this investment quickly, and to justify this kind of spending. And I'm quite skeptical that they will see that.
Did you know that Canada is a global leader in the production of medical isotopes? Canadian isotopes are life-saving tools used around the world every day to diagnose and treat cancers, sterilize medical equipment, and advance medical research. For decades, Canadian nuclear innovation has powered breakthroughs across healthcare, industry, and research. And today, through the Isotopes for Hope campaign, the Canadian Nuclear Isotope Council is working to double our isotope production by 2030. Why? Because the world is counting on Canada. Medical isotopes are a promise that patients will get faster, more accurate diagnoses, a promise that hospitals will have the tools they need to precisely treat cancer and other diseases, and a promise that Canada will continue to lead in the development of nuclear technologies that benefit people here at home and around the world. From our CANDU power reactor fleet to our accelerator network, from research labs to hospitals, Canadians are driving innovation that brings hope and saves lives. By supporting Isotopes for Hope, we're not only securing Canada's leadership in the global isotope market, but we're also helping build a healthier future for everyone. The world is counting on us, but we can only rise to this challenge if we work together. It will take all of us, industry, the healthcare sector, governments, and the scientific community, all aligned to maximize the potential of Canadian-made isotopes and ensure that we continue to bring hope to patients when they need it most. Learn more at www.canadianisotopes.ca. Well, I mean, it's certainly a political challenge. And Jennifer, I think I'm interested in your thoughts over the medium term after this budget, because to my eye, it is, and you look at the whole budgeting technique of the two, the two lines, and for consumption and for investment, etc. It feels to me like it's a very, very large shift from consumption to investment in terms of the federal government's role in the Canadian economy. And so it's going to take away from things that tend to have an immediate impact for some Canadians, and it's going to put that money into things that either Canadians will never feel, like defense, or that they may feel more, over the longer term in some more indirect way through business investment. And Canadians may now recognize the need for defense spending, but it's never been something that's near and dear to our hearts. I'm just wondering how this shift from, especially at a time when, if I might say, I think that an increasing number of Canadians are actually really struggling with their lives. That the cost of living pressure is not a complaint from people who are wealthy enough to afford this, but is an actual cry for help from people that are not making it. So that's my sort of general take. And at that time, we're doing this shift from consumption to investment. And I'm wondering how that's going to play out for Canadians over the medium term.
Lots in there. Oh my goodness. Lots in there to deal with. Okay, so let me first of all start with the point around will Canadians feel the defense spending? So number one, let's all hope and pray that they don't have to. But we're in a pretty unstable global environment right now, and we have a neighbor to the south who has basically said, if you don't get right on defense, we will continue to hurt you economically, right? And even if we do start to get on the right side of defense, they might continue to hurt us economically for their own gain. Anyways, so that's the context that we're in. So it is entirely possible, unfortunately, the Canadians might feel the benefits of the defense spending because something terrible has happened. So I just wanted to say that. Yes, I know I'm full of sunshine and lollipops today. But I think this government has bet big that when they defined the capital budget versus operating, remember, anything that isn't capital in their new nomenclature is by definition operating. And that's the part that they want to bring into so-called fiscal balance. But when they define that, like, there's a lot of stuff in there that is all about like public sector infrastructure, public assets. There's a lot of stuff in there that is about capital investment by businesses. And the one and only thing that kind of really directly tackles that issue of households and affordability has to do with housing. And we know, like, we can't just magic, new housing supply overnight. Like, there's a serious effort, there's a serious investment. They've signaled that that's a priority. But otherwise, the only other way that you're going to feel any benefit to that capital spending is if you happen to yourself already be a capital holder, right? Like, if you are yourself already in the market with investments,
which are the people that are already doing well.
They're the people who are already reasonably comfortable and fairly well off.
Yeah.
Now, I do want to acknowledge there are a couple of pieces that are in this budget that are not at all related to capital spending, that are intended to help folks who are probably like at the most vulnerable on the operating side. But yeah, I think that this is a bit of a miss in terms of thinking through how do we ensure that more Canadians can be stakeholders in benefiting from this serious investment in capital. And to Ben's point about like thinking a bit more outside the box and not just trying to meet the United States on, for example, tax treatment, but also thinking about like where are our strategic advantages? And I know Ben mentioned, like, for example, critical minerals and energy, especially renewable energy, I would add to that. And our supply of water is going to be increasingly important, but it's our skilled workforce, like it's our workers, right? That's also a huge strategic asset, and also our stability relative to the economy to our south, right? And so I don't know that they kind of got that part of the equation in terms of thinking through how do we use tools like the employment insurance system to complement the kind of transformation that we're trying to see in different sectors. So that's what I mean about the part that I feel like is missing.
Can I just jump in here? Because and I totally agree with Jen's point about the miss on EI. I think if you're preparing for the recession or a potential recession, like, it's the obvious thing you need to do, and we just haven't done it. We just need to get on with doing it. But the consequence of the capital budget framework that she just described, let's play that out for a second, because there's a really good example here. So on housing, right? The thing that qualifies, as Jen mentioned, is housing supply measures. Okay. David, if you remember, we had a housing pod on the Hurly Burly a few months ago
Yeah.
with a few other folks, and Mike Moffat made a strong pitch for taking GST off, which they're currently doing for first-time home buyers for new builds, but to extend that to everyone else because it would be a way to juice demand. And actually, if you juice demand, not only is that good for homeowners, it potentially will also create the conditions for people to want to build more, right? And the problem here, I mean, you heard me say, I think that's a dumb idea for a
I don't
bunch of
understand,
reasons.
by the way, why that doesn't just raise the price of houses.
It would.
That could be
You
one of
raise
one of the
demand,
issues.
the prices go up. Like
Yeah.
Yes.
this is basics, anyway, okay.
But let's say though that principle that if you juice demand in the short term because we have so much supply that's stopped, right, that's seized up because the market is just not going to build because there's no buyers out there, right, that in the short term what you have to do is create buyers in order to then get supply. If you believe that, right, and that actually could be true to a certain extent, you can't do that under this capital budgeting framework because if you believe, as the Department of Finance believes, that that is only a second or a third order effect in the economy, it's not the first order effect in the economy, then it doesn't count as capital in that context. And so it really comes down now to how can you make the case that your particular proposal is actually going to fit in this capital budgeting framework. It is transformational for the budget long term. I think it's for the good, but in this specific kind of case where we're trying to deal with the crisis in the housing market, it has an effect of biasing a decision in a way that I'm not sure necessarily people would want it to be biased.
So housing's one thing, right? But there's a lot of social policy pressure points. Tyler, I work closely with people about food insecurity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of evidence that that problem is growing in a large way in this country. And so that's another indication of pressure points. So when you look at this approach to budgeting and you look at we're going to balance consumption or operating, whatever you call it, Ben, doesn't that sound like the end of social policy?
I don't think so, and I do want to return to housing here for a second. That
Yeah.
housing, housing is the perfect example of somewhere where actually the way that the macro stuff and the micro stuff interact, right? So part of the way that part of the challenge we face in this country is that a lot of money that housing is a fundamentally unproductive productive investment, and some of that, a lot of capital in this country now gets sucked into real estate because it just it just generates a return that why would you not invest in it if you have large scale capital? But if you actually want to fix the kind of the productivity problems this country faces, we need to fix housing. One, because we need to fix that investment problem. But two, if we want to actually attract talent to this country, things like housing are a big lag on that, right? Like if you're talent, let's say you're one of these people that we're trying to poach from the United States,
Right.
and you're looking at maybe taking a job in I don't know, Toronto or somewhere like that. Well, then you look at how much it costs to live there. That might actually dissuade you from moving there, right? So there's a macro reason to fix housing, but there's also the micro reason, right? I do think this is where the budget falls short, especially. It really some of the promises that even the Liberals made even in the election in their platform were scaled back in this budget compared to what was originally promised. So I know that doesn't directly answer your question about social policy, but look, I see this, maybe I see this holistically, and I think one of the big things we need to figure out in this country is part of, the reason we have social programs and stuff like that is fundamental questions around fairness and justice in this country, and the way that the housing system enriches, existing asset owners and, to be blunt, screws people that don't. It's a macro question, but it's also a question of fundamental fairness, and it's somewhere where I do think the budget genuinely disappoints.
Right. Thanks. Jen, can you take a crack at my question about social policy, though? I mean, do you see any opening for you to go and pitch the government on uh, something that might cost money to solve a social problem?
Okay, well, okay, so I have spent 6 years pitching them on making it easier for people to get access to benefits by filing their taxes, and they are making some progress on that, right?
Yeah.
So I just shout out to them on that, and moving to a system of tax agency reconciliation for about 17% of tax filers a year is like that's not nothing. So
That's right. No, that's
kudos
good. That
to
was
them.
yeah.
Kudos to them on that. They also are doing a little thing on the disability benefit, which, David, you'll know a lot of the folks who are like the highest proportion of people who are often food insecure, often people who have disabilities, right? So
The
the
food bank
tiny,
people tell you that there's nothing you could do to relieve the pressure on food banks like taking care of disabled people properly.
right, right,
Right.
right. And so they're making a change that is actually more efficient to help people cover the costs of actually getting certification to get the disability benefit.
Right.
So okay, like okay, good. But like I've had conversations
But
with
the
some of these
disability benefit itself was a
small,
a
it's too small.
dime disguised as a manhole cover, right?
It's too small. It
Mm.
exists. It's
Mm.
better, I guess, than not existing, but it's too small.
Yeah.
Anyways, so in terms of the
It is $2
window,
billion a year, just to be clear. But yes.
but okay. Um, However, when I pitched some of the folks on the idea, for example, of saying you are projecting like persistently higher rates of unemployment for a little while, you're also projecting the potential for some churn, like desirable churn in the labor market where people are going to like need to leave one job and you want them to move into another sector. The EEI system is kind of set up to support on that. You might want to think about increasing the maximum insurable earnings. Like it was like talking to a statue, like no reaction, no take up whatsoever. So it's kind of weird. It's like they're interested in, it seems to me, in some of these pieces that are sort of for like the most low income, the most vulnerable. And this was also echoed in Carney's speech before the budget, right? That social policy is there to help the people who are the most worst, like the most poorly off, right? But they're not really thinking about social policy as a tool of economic policy as well, right? And that's where I think some of the disconnect is.
Right.
Let me,
Tyler,
let me,
anything on that before we move on?
Yeah, look, I'll just say I do agree. I think that there is a risk both for liberals, because I'm speaking here to liberals as well, but also for broader social policy about the absence of a kind of a clear social policy agenda. And to make it specific, like there's $5 billion in this budget for an investment in hospital infrastructure. But apart from the PSW tax credit, and that's great. Like, really glad that got across the line. That's going to help some low paid people that are very important in our healthcare system. There isn't, under this new budgeting framework going forward, going to be the ability to easily pay for the nurses that will staff that hospital, right? And so, I do think that there comes a question of how strictly are you going to have to adhere to this principle going forward? And as we think forward to a potential election, like the Liberal Party of Canada is going to need another future big social policy idea. And, building affordable housing is a great social policy idea. And this capital framework allows you to build lots of social housing. But how do we staff that housing with the complementary employment and addiction supports to make sure that it deals with homelessness? How do we ensure that there's access to a broader range of community supports? How do we deal with disability supports, as you just mentioned, David? Like the Liberal Party of Canada is going to need a big social policy idea in the future. And you are a little bit constrained as a result of this budgeting framework. And people should not lose sight of that fact. I think it could have a big impact long term.
let me jump in here quickly. I also just want to add, when we talk about debt and deficits, this does matter for this stuff as well, right? So I came prepared with the numbers. So when you have debt, it means you have charges on those debt. It means you pay money for that debt. And in the current right now, we're spending $53 billion just servicing our debt. And by 2029, 2030, that's going to go up to $76 billion. So that's money spent servicing debt that, that money could in theory be going towards it could be going towards social programs, right? So there's an argument for kind of fiscal restraint that actually is about protecting these programs. The longer we run it, the more debt we run up, the longer we run these deficits, the more debt we build, the less money there is for these social programs. And then, eventually if the bill comes due, the things that get cut are these social programs, and the people that get hurt are the people that rely on these programs.
Ben, that's a great segue to one of the elephants wandering around in this room, which is fiscal policy. It also sounds like an excerpt from a Paul Martin speech in the 1990s.
You wrote, David, right?
So, Ben, we have in fiscal policy terms here, we've got this new way of budgeting. We've got this commitment to restraint on operations, and we've got a commitment to spend quite large amounts of money, deficit financed on investment. All of it means that, as people say, it's all debt. So there's large debt increasing. The government abandoned the fiscal anchors that nobody thought Chrystia Freeland nobody thought Chrystia Freeland's anchors were very strong. The government's abandoned those for even weaker fiscal anchors. What do you consider to be a responsible fiscal policy in this environment?
Well, I think when Poilievre came out in his pre-budget messaging, he called for keeping the deficit to $42 billion, right? That's not an insignificant amount of money either. The point is getting us back on the right track, getting us back to a point where it's shrinking every year, and we have kind of long-term sustainable fiscal management. I think what this budget, as much as it makes this split between operating and capital spending, which if that capital spending generates a return, then in theory that in the long run that pays off. But it has to do that, and I think I'm going to repeat myself here, but this kind of Ottawa-centric, Ottawa knows best approach for that, I think there's reasons to be skeptical that might work. But I also think there's still no clear, as you said, the fiscal guardrails in here have been weakened even more. And I think a lot of this actually relies less on the credibility of the budget itself and more on the personal credibility of the Prime Minister as, two-time central banker, as this economist in chief, as Tyler has called him in some stuff that we've written at MBP Intelligence. So, it's relying on that credibility, but I do think there's a world where his credibility itself might diminish over time if it doesn't look like he's actually made the correct decisions on that.
If the budget was 40 billion, and I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of Pierre Poilievre, by the way, I'm really not. So I'm more interested in your own point of view, right? If the deficit was 40 billion instead of what it is, what shouldn't be done of what is being done?
Well, look, I think it would be hard for the opposition to give you a fully worked out, this is how we're going to do it, because I think when I worked in the OLO, there were 8 policy people working on our team. The government has, thousands of people in departments to help them with this. So I do. But
everybody knows where the big buckets are.
Well, look, and I think the government has signaled some changes to some shrinking of the public service here. Some, I think even people that are generally not, on the right will agree that the public sector has ballooned and gotten, it's grown certainly beyond any kind of sustainable rate, but it's gotten out of control. I think that's the first natural area you would look. So I don't know whether exactly what it would have looked like, let's say conservatives were in government right now, but I suspect that's probably one area they would have turned for sure. And look, there'd be other areas too. I suspect the government would probably be there's all sorts of kind of large scale programs that the government is using to try and spur investment. I think the conservative approach of, again, getting government out of the way, that also means taking that public capital, taking it, getting rid of some of these wasteful allocation of capital, some of this wasteful allocation of capital in the public sector, in government, and letting the private sector blossom as a result. You don't have to agree with that, but I think that would have been the broad kind of get government out of the way, which would have meant would have been things that have just naturally fallen by the wayside with that.
Tyler, I didn't think the government was going to be serious about cutting spending when I heard the Prime Minister in the campaign rule out any touching of transfers, because that's where the money is, right?
Yeah. No, it's true. It's true. And what's funny is
there's probably too many people working by tens of thousands and various other ways you could find efficiencies. But where is the big money in federal spending? It's in the
transfers to people,
to governments and people.
Yeah, no, for sure. And look, if you look at the savings that they've identified, they're pretty much in line, more or less, with what we had in the platform. Give or take $1 billion here or there, but it's pretty much in line with that. And that's actually shallower as a cut than the 15% number that was starting to float around in public reporting in the late summer, early fall, when departments were asked to put forward their ideas.
Right. And
I don't know if it's because, did they ask for 15% because they didn't believe that the system would truly put forward good options? So you have to kind of you have to shoot for a higher number in order to actually land in a good place. I think there's some truth to that. But I think it's also interesting that they didn't go deeper. They basically hit the mark of what the Prime Minister said he was going to do in the platform, and he's done it. As I said earlier, I think it's still a little too early to say whether or not that's a pain-free $55 billion. Because I think what's interesting is the composition of that savings, in the sense that it's a lot more of the traditional pruning of programs and grants and contributions and people, as opposed to structural reform of government, where you take it apart and you look at, can I do something more efficiently with the application of AI, for example, in government? Can I rethink the relationship between how we think about benefits and pay? They're only starting kind of at that broader structural reform, and I still think there's opportunity there for additional efficiencies.
Okay.
Can I
Jennifer,
just do
what's
a quick
happened to
thing?
the environment around fiscal policy such that you can promise to run deficits of 60 to 70 billion dollars as far as the eye can see, and nobody even suggests that you might get downgraded?
Well, okay, whoa. Hang on though. It's also think about like geopolitically the environment that we're in, right? So Canada has been able to maintain a really good bond rating. When you look at the yields on the 10-year bonds, they're really attractive.
Right.
From the fiscal, policy perspective, less attractive, anyway. So like we are reaping still a premium of the stability of our system, like the stability of our government, the predictability of our policy making. Like that, I think that's the dividend that we are reaping in terms of the international community not setting their hair on fire. I just wanted to say though, I mean, number one, you're right. Like that toothpaste is like it's out of the tube, right? Nobody is setting their hair on fire anymore about getting to a balanced budget. Um, I think for the vast majority of people, like whether it's 42 billion is the right number or 78, like fundamentally, what matters is what are you using that spending for, right? Like what are you using, what are you directing the public investment for? You're right, we haven't talked yet about revenue changes, revenue side changes, and the fact that this budget does not look for new revenues really in a meaningful way. If anything, it's cutting them, sometimes in kind of funny little corners. But I just wanted to say, actually, I mean, I don't know, whatever, we should take it with a grain of salt, I suppose. But they have gone back to the fiscal anchor of declining deficit to GDP, and that is currently what they're projecting. They're projecting a fairly flat, debt to GDP ratio. But they're also, I think it's important to remember, they are also not projecting something that was remotely what you guys faced in 1994, 95.
Right.
Totally different situation.
How much do the people executing policy matter, Tyler? Do you think that Trudeau Freeland could have introduced this budget?
Yeah, I think they could have. Well, I mean, I think there are some elements that would be different, especially on the climate competitiveness side. But I think, yeah, they certainly could have introduced this budget. I mean,
No, so
some of
would
the
I guess what I was asking is, would the markets have reacted differently to them putting those kind of spending profile on the table as opposed
no.
to no?
No, I don't. No, I don't think so. I mean, the markets have reacted with a shrug, right? I mean, I think we should acknowledge it's true what Ben says that the prime minister's personal credibility is very important here. It buys us a bit of time, and it buys us, as Jen mentions, a bit of an advantage relative, particularly to the U.S. Right? Like our debt is about on any given day somewhere between 80 to 100 basis points lower, less costlier than the U.S. debt, and that translates into real savings, right? We have about a trillion and a half of market debt. That would be potentially $15 billion a year in extra debt charges we'd have to pay. So to a certain extent, yes, personalities matter. I think they matter though less in terms of the overall structure of the document per se, because in some ways, some of what's in this budget are actually based on building blocks that Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland started.
Yeah.
But I think what will be different is the execution. I think that this government has needed, if it needed a jolt, it needed a jolt in leadership in key parts of government and key leadership of key agencies like the Major Projects Office, like the Defense Investment Agency, like Build Canada Homes, where it could reach out and bring people from the private sector who I think will have a better track record of execution on some of the big mission sets that the Prime Minister has set.
All right. Just flipping around here while we wrap up to get a few subjects in. Jennifer, what is the state, as near as you can tell, of climate policy in Canada at the federal
Quiet,
level after this
quiet,
budget? What? What did you say?
quiet.
Be quiet,
It's quiet,
right?
Um, yeah. Um, so, look, climate is not a policy space that I usually spend a lot of time in, but I'm fortunate enough to work with some really smart young people for whom this is near and dear. right? And for them, I think that they looked at this budget and felt some disappointment and some surprise given the Prime Minister's own personal track record. Um, so, look, I mean, there are some pieces in here where I can kind of wrap my head around, look, we're trying to get more profitability, we're trying to get more development, we're trying to get more growth, and we're trying to do this in a way that isn't completely unsustainable, right? So like Canada does have an advantage in terms of renewable energy, right? There's some stuff in the budget on that. But, getting rid of EV mandates and getting rid of climate pricing and all the rest, or carbon pricing and all the rest of it, I'm not sure that they have communicated clearly enough to folks that had lent their vote on the basis that of Carney's own climate bona fides. I don't know that they've necessarily communicated well enough to them. Like there's not a direct, subsidy for coal, for example, in here. Like nothing quite egregious that way. Just pulled that out as like the most ridiculous, example. But I would say it's like this is very quiet kinds of climate policy, right? Like they've kind of walked away from some of that stuff.
Right. I mean, Ben, to my, like, I'm not a policy expert, but to my ear, one of the largest rhetorical shifts from the Trudeau government to the Carney government is around climate. Right. I used to fight with the Trudeau people because they wouldn't say jobs without putting clean in front of it. Right. And so like everything had to be tied to the environment in some way or another. And this government is quite different in that respect. On a substantive basis, what do you think is changing?
Well, look, I think something I noticed. I noticed in the budget was that they the Liberal government themselves referred to the consumer carbon tax as divisive, which is just it was a fascinating admission in many ways. And of course, it was the Prime Minister that actually ended up axing the tax. I think Pierre did all the work for him, and then the Prime Minister finished the job. But something has shifted, right? And I do think if you go look at things that the Prime Minister was saying, that Carney was saying a few years ago. His I would love to be a fly on the wall or get inside his brain and see what he's thinking about this, because I don't actually doubt that he is a climate is something that's quite near and dear to his heart. He's written a lot about it. He was the now collapsed net zero banking alliance was kind of he was very much involved in. And so I do think one of the, if you'd asked me a year ago something that we would see from this government, knowing what we know now, I don't think I would have predicted that the government would basically go quiet on a lot of these things. And I think there's probably some practical, again, I think there's crises clarifies the mind. And I think part of what's going on there is that the government has realized that one, this stuff is politically damaging. The consumer price especially was politically damaging for them. It took them a while to realize that, but they did realize it in the end. But I also think there's probably a recognition of the broader global climate right now. And I don't want to say that climate policy is a luxury belief, because it's not. I do think we should take it very seriously, but I do think when there's more, it's in many ways it's a very abstract thing, right? It's something that it's a second order thing where if you're worried about paying your bills and you're worried about groceries, or you're worried about 100,000 auto jobs vanishing in Southern Ontario, this is the kind of thing that probably it's not that you forget about it, but it's something that you probably just it goes down the priority list. And if I had to guess what's going on, I think that's probably what's going on.
Yeah, Tyler, I rationalize it the same way that Ben rationalizes it, because I do think the Prime Minister cares a lot about climate, and I just assume he found himself in a position where the country's in a crisis, in an economic crisis, and it's all hands on deck to deal with that economic crisis. Didn't anticipate that 3 years ago or whatever. But it does sort of, if that's the thesis, it does sort of validate the argument that climate action is antithetical to economic growth, which is the opposite of the thesis that the Trudeau government tried to embody throughout its tenure, which is that economic growth and climate action went hand in hand, and that a strong environment and a strong economy were completely compatible with each other.
To a certain extent, yes, I think you're right. Although it's funny, this morning I attended a speech where Julie DeBruzen, the Minister of the Environment, was saying, the thing that the climate competitiveness strategy, as outlined in the budget, does is it brings the economic muscle to the table that we haven't had before, which I thought was an interesting way of trying to reframe the same thing. But what's interesting, David, is that I think this proposition will be tested around what happens in the trade-off that's proposed in the strategy between the oil and gas cap and
Prepositions is a different podcast.
Yes, I know. Yes. um, so like I think if we look at this and we say, okay, well, maybe it feels like we're walking back on climate action because we're getting rid of something and replacing it with another. And, an oil and gas cap sounds like a really stringent thing. But if you're replacing it with a higher industrial price, that's a pretty strong commitment to, a market-based pricing system, right, which the prime minister has always believed in. And you could make a case that that's actually a better system than a retail-facing one. I think where we made a mistake on climate policy was that we put too much emphasis on consumers and less emphasis on big polluters and industrial polluters. But there's a world in which you don't need the oil and gas cap if you have a very effective industrial price. And the question for the prime minister, I think, will be, at what level do you set that price where you don't still see a human cry from the business community that this is too onerous, and you don't have Danielle Smith breathing down your throat saying you got rid of an oil and gas cap, but you've raised the industrial price so high that we actually can't produce the oil that we want to pump.
But you have to set it pretty high in order to make carbon capture a worthwhile initiative, right?
Correct. Yes, correct. That's right. You have to, and they've clearly indicated in the strategy that not only are they thinking about increasing that price beyond 2030 where it currently ends, but also basically saying the federal backstop will come into place if provinces don't come along, i.e. Danielle Smith and Scott Moe, and that will be very visible about saying and showing consumers that that backstop has been brought in because provinces have refused to act on big polluters. That's going to be a really interesting debate to play out, especially because it's wrapped up in the grand bargain around a pipeline.
Okay, here's how I want to wrap up. So there are budgets and there are budgets. So Paul Martin delivered 9 budgets. Some of them were, all of them were consequential. Some of them were very large in measures. People remember one. 25 years later, people remember one. Right? So will this budget be, is this an important budget that will be remembered? Yes or no, and why or why not? Jennifer, let's start with you.
Okay, this budget will probably be remembered in the National Capital Region. Beyond that, I don't know for sure. So this budget will probably be remembered by public servants and by the mayor of Ottawa and by, the downtown dry cleaners and sandwich shops and so forth. Outside of that, I'm going to have to wait and see. But for the record, David, I also remember the skills budget. I just want to say, I don't just remember one.
Terry will be pleased. Ben.
I do think this budget matters just because it was this was the first budget of a government is always going to be important, so it matters in that sense. I do think it matters as well. As I was saying earlier, I do think that the government really did hype this thing up as something, and so maybe. Like I think there's probably a world where the government, if I had to guess, I don't talk to the Prime Minister every day. That probably doesn't surprise you, but if I had to guess, they probably see this as kind of part one, and I'm sure they feel like there's unfinished work. But again, I don't know that there's risks doing that. So but as you say, people maybe remember one budget. I don't know that people remember budgets after this. So this budget may be remembered precisely because it didn't meet the moment and didn't offer the kind of transformative generational change that we were told it was going to deliver.
That's quite possible that if Martin hadn't delivered the 95 budget, maybe people would remember the 94 budget as the failure budget. Anyway, that's an interesting point. Tyler, what do you think?
I think it'll be remembered in very specific industries and niche verticals. I'm not sure about whether it'll be remembered by every Canadian, but it'll be remembered certainly, if you are in the housing sector, it'll be remembered because Build Canada Homes was created. It'll be remembered in the innovation sector because it's the budget that started the creation of a Canadian stablecoin. And in the defense world, it'll be remembered as a budget that, as you recall, David, from the 90s, the decade of darkness. This is going to be a budget that, although there was increasing investment over the last number of years in defense, this is certainly a budget that started a supercharging of investment in defense. And so for those reasons, yes, I think it will be remembered. I think it does matter. I'm not sure that every Canadian will remember it in the same iconic sense as the 95 budget. But frankly, I'm not sure that we would want them to remember it that way, because I don't think the 95 budget in the long run, well, I'll put it to you this way. In the long run, the 95 budget had a pretty negative impact on social policy. It balanced the books, but it did so in a pretty hard way.
Right. Here's reverse order the question. When we win, when we have the strongest economy in the G7, when we have given ourselves more than anybody can take from us, when we're no longer afraid of Donald Trump because we have diversified our economy so much and he's still in office. When all that's true, is it this budget that we will look to, or is there going to have to be a different budget that we will look to?
Well, I mean, I would say, David, that that one of the key things that will be important for us to change those trading relationships will be A, to change the culture in the business community, and B, to also put in place the trade enabling infrastructure reports and so forth that will allow us to export to other markets. And this budget certainly starts that trade infrastructure stuff. I'm not sure that it necessarily is going to change the culture in business, because that isn't something that a budget in and of itself can change.
Right. Last words, Ben, Jennifer?
I think if this is part one, then that is a vulnerability for we're I know people think that the government looks pretty safe right now, but I do think with the gift of hindsight, overpromise in politics, the rule is you underpromise and you overdeliver. I think they've probably done the exact opposite here, and that's from a purely political lens, that's ill-advised.
Yeah. It's the best way to get a date, though.
At least one date, maybe not a second date. Saying, Okay, so my take on this would be, I think Ben is right. I think this is probably a part one. And the challenge is going to be that for some of the pieces that are necessary and essential, that are in this budget, that are in the right direction, it is going to take multiple budgets of holding the course to see those through. And there's going to also, as I said before, I think there's also going to have to be a budget that grapples with the workforce pivoting along with the investment community and the business community as well. And so that piece is also still needed. But this has to, for this stuff to work in terms of the defense sector, in terms of infrastructure projects, this is going to be a course that takes way more than just the life of one government, right?
Right.
But hopefully Donald Trump is not still in office by the time that then we're talking.
That's a whole other conversation. I'm happy to have it with you over many drinks. Tyler, you look like you got something to say.
I just want to say one thing, and people will think that I may be crass for saying this, but I think it actually encapsulates a little bit of the question about business investment that we've been talking about all throughout this podcast, right? So this budget took off the luxury tax on personal jets. And it did so after 3 intense years of lobbying on the part of Bombardier to get rid of that, because it effectively acts as a manufacturing tax on their product. That's great for them. I would say to you, where are the additional jobs that Bombardier is going to add at their plant, because suddenly it's cheaper to buy a personal jet? That's what we need to see.
Right. Got me as skeptical on that one. Anyway, thank you all very much. Thank you, Jennifer and Tyler, for coming back to do this. And Ben, thanks for joining us for the first time. It was a lot of fun. Good to hang out with you. I want to thank the sponsors of this show and all you Herle Burly-ites who watched or listened. Thanks for joining us for this, and we'll see you next week. In the meantime, take care of yourself.
Herle Burly.